Only four of us?
I think five. I can't tell who's missing.
Think we're missing Baxter.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to wait until like 2, 3 more minutes.
All right. Did she change the groups again?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right, you ready then?
Let's go for it.
I guess I could start on the first question. The podcast mentions a number of misperceptions that people tend to hold when they think about Washington, D.C. What are some of those misperceptions, and why did the people featured in the podcast think that those misunderstandings negatively impact their fight for statehood? I kind of just focused on the first episode and that people kind of see DC as just full of transient politicians, bureaucrats. They don't really think about the long-term residents of the city, and that can cause people to not really think about the need for statehood because they don't think about the real residents.
I
Yes.
said, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just saying,
It was in episode 6 I saw in the transcript where I forget someone was doing some podcast and they were making a phone call and like the one guy from some area was like, "Oh yeah, DC's just a bunch of people who are federal employees and stuff like that." And so it just kind of adds on to what Sean was saying about people just kind of thinking DC is more just federal employees instead of like actual residents that live there.
I said almost exactly the same thing, just talking about I mentioned Edwina Williams, who like was a DC native, and she talks in episode 1 about how she has like a family and friends and a life, and she has nothing to do with politics and she doesn't work there, but she's still in the fight for DC statehood. And I also think that's like a crazy thought process to have, because how do you not think that there's neighborhoods in an area or like people live there? How's it just politicians?
Yeah, I kind of piggybacked off that. I feel like this kind of goes into like the next question, but I talked about like maybe like because we live so close to DC, like we understand like the neighborhood aspect, like what you were talking about. Um, but other than like resident wise, I had also said that like in episode 3, there's a newscaster, I can't remember the name, like setting a narrative of like DC is like a crime-ridden city. And like it gives the argument that like Washingtonians cannot govern themselves, which is obviously a misconception, and that Congress can do it. And I also said that it's not very like compelling just because at the time that it's a crime-ridden city, Congress is the one controlling it. So it's kind of like going back on what they're saying. So like what's happening now obviously isn't working.
Yeah, I completely agree with what's been said, and I just think I wrote about the issues that came about with like the president being in control of certain things. So like since there's no governor in the area, like I thought that was very important when I started looking at like responsibilities that governors have in other states, and like just some of the things that are looked over without that central leadership in DC, if that makes sense. I also just I also noted that like no one I didn't know that there was a bill that died in the Senate, like the first time a statehood bill had been passed, or almost passed for DC. I felt like that wasn't really like made prevalent in like the general news or anything like that, or maybe I missed it. I know this podcast is a couple years old, but yeah, I found that interesting.
Uh, I was put in, I kind of piggybacked off what everyone said, but I found an example of it in episode 6. A reporter interviewed a man from Tennessee about the DC statehood, and he said that he like had no idea that DC didn't have any representation or any representative in Congress. Though like we did know that they have a delegate who like can't vote but can still introduce bills. I kind of just wrote that like this guy had no idea that DC didn't have any representation or could vote for any like congressional elections or anything like that, yet pay taxes that are like I want to say one of like the highest tax rates in the country or something like that. I picked up, and I think kind of like what everyone said, it kind of just piggybacks off of like there just seems to be a very lack of awareness of like DC statehood and how much of an issue it is, considering like these are United States citizens that can still draft for war, pay taxes, like that don't have any representation.
Move on to the second part.
Yeah.
When you did think about Washington, D.C., did you operate under any of these misperceptions that are discussed in the podcast? I think I think it was Tala was saying earlier. I mean, I lived right by DC. I spent a lot of time there, and I don't think I really operated under any of those misperceptions. I mean, if you actually spend time in the city, you realize that there's a lot of real people there.
Yeah, I kind of agree with
She said, I'm from like the Richmond area. I'm like 20 minutes from Richmond. So, but I was still wouldn't say I wouldn't have any like misperceptions that were discussed. It's just not something I really like thought about. So like I knew like fully about like DC and everything and how it worked. It's just not something I really like.
thought about when it came to like statements, and it does kind of opened me up to like really thinking about how they're kind of getting
And how they're all kind of getting like screwed up there in their way of life.
Yeah, honestly, I had known about the issue. I have some like family in DC and some friends who have family who've lived there for a long time. And so I've like talked about the issues and stuff like that, but it's more of like, like dinner table conversations and just like casually, but never really looked into it. I think like the biggest surprise for me was like just how like deep rooted like the issues went with like budgeting and laws, and how much like citizens have absolutely zero control over that. And it's just like um I don't know, that just like loses a point of any form of representation. I feel like we're failing as a country if we can't do that for our like most central form of leadership.
Yeah, I had said, well, I said earlier about like how since like we're all kind of closer to DC, we probably have like a better grasp on everything. I don't think like I was operating under any of these misperceptions, but I would definitely say like I wasn't aware of the fact that like DC itself has a population bigger than 2 states. Like I think that was like really eye-opening to me. So it's not really like a misperception. I feel like I just like also like learned about things that like I just like wouldn't normally like think about or like talk about on a daily basis.
I said also basically exactly what you guys were saying, but I didn't grow up in Virginia or like even the East Coast. And like I grew up in Texas and we still know that real people live in DC. So to me, that was kind of just like, I don't know, I feel like that argument is really dumb. It's lacking common sense. But I never really thought about DC at all. And I didn't realize that there were until like there were disparities. Like I didn't know they didn't get a vote. I honestly thought their representative did get to vote in Congress and they had all the same rights as the other states. But now that they don't, I think that really encapsulates the whole argument for DC statehood is that simply people just don't know what's happening.
And I kind of to piggyback off that, like even from being around like in Virginia, up like not Nova, but I live a little bit up north. Like I guess I've never really thought about it. So like I guess the misconception I kind of just thought about other things and not DC statehood because there's never really an issue that was in the news. It's not really an issue that you see or think about day to day. When you think about hot topic issues, you think about more like stuff like immigration or stuff like climate change. You never really think of like DC statehood. So like I feel like it just never came up. So it's nothing that I really like personally really like thought about until like mostly this year when I came into college and it became more of a topic that was talked about. So I was just unaware.
Yeah, I think it's just like not mainstream like at all. I feel like we're kind of moving into like the next part where it's like, how would you feel like if you were a resident of DC? And honestly, like my one word that I put down was like it would really just be like not like encouraging. Like I would just be like really discouraged. I just wouldn't probably go vote, things like that, which kind of sucks. Like that's a huge population, like I had said, like bigger than two states that are just like missing out on like all these democratic practices.
I just said I would stop paying taxes.
I
Yeah, I
think
actually brought up like spending a lot of time in DC. I had thought about it a lot because you constantly see those no taxation without representation license plates everywhere. And I'm like, yeah, I think I'd be pissed if I wasn't getting representation and they're taking all this money out of my paycheck.
Yeah, yeah. I think the exact number was like there's over 2 dozen states that have lower taxes than them by far. That's just absurd. It's so absurd. I don't know, that just goes into so many things and like it's not even like DC is really seeing all that money that they're paying for. Like they don't really have any understanding because they don't have a budget. They don't have like a formidable, well, I mean they do like it's controlled, but it's not controllable by citizens or like arguable by citizens. Um, which is understandable because like Congress and the president they have other things that they need to like push for and they're working for. Their job should be the overall basis of the entire country. It should not be to focus on our capital, but it should be a priority.
If I live in DC, I think I don't think it would be all the time, but after like understanding some of the issues, I think I'd be pretty pissed. Like kind of like you were saying, just like getting paid or getting taxed so much off like a paycheck or like paying like that much and then just to like not be represented and then like would just kind of like send me a little bit because it's also like I feel like I've had to listen to like the congressman that like we heard in the podcast talk back and forth about how it's just a power grab and like all this, that, and a third. It's kind of like I do understand that, but it's like there is a massive amount of people that are being unrepresented, and like that's pretty much what I could say the country was founded on within the phrase like you said, vaccine or taxation and representation. Like that's what we were founded on. And there is a district that has more than like states in population that aren't represented. So I think I'd be pretty mad.
I think going off of
Kind of what Aiden said, I think I'll also be like just like frustrated because not only about this whole thing that we just discussing about like taxation without representation, but it's also like in episode 3 or 4 they're talking about it was we were talking about home rule and kind of what Baxter was saying about Congress kind of ruling over DC, but they're not really like prioritizing it because they're worried about other things. So I think it'd be pretty frustrated with like before home rule not being able to like get anything done or fix anything because it all had to go through Congress to like just Baxter said like
was worrying about
other things versus taking care of the city and focusing on little things.
Ready to move on? What sorts of arguments were used during the founding era of US history to justify the decision to locate the hold on, my browser just locked. Locate the capital in Washington, D.C. and to create it as a non-state? I just said the strategic location between the North and South, and as for having it as a non-state, because they didn't want undue state influence on federal government. I feel like that was a pretty simple one. I don't know.
Yeah, I was reading that just like it seems like a good idea in theory. Like it all seemed too theoretical. Like it just kind of like these broad jumps into like what could be a utopia, but like I don't know. When I thought about it, I feel like I've always tried to picture the founding fathers were trying to avoid like the same mistakes that everybody made, thinking that their perfect world is plausible. If that makes sense, and I think this is just another example of like a situation that couldn't have worked.
Yeah, I got most of this answer from episode 2. I'm pretty sure it talked about this a lot. But for me, it just sounds like a fear response. They basically were saying that like Congress like needed to have an exclusive right to control the place that they were located. I think that they thought, like without control, like Congress would be in danger and things like that. I just don't think they should have drawn the district as big as they did if they wanted to keep it that way. Just obviously because of like the backlash and everything that's happening now.
I said essentially the same thing. I also referenced episode 2 a lot because that was the history one mainly. I think it was interesting that they were really like at the time the founding fathers were pushing like not having a two-party system, but the whole reason that like the whole way that they founded DC as a state initially and like how they got the vote of sending the voters to go back to either Maryland or Virginia, depending on where they were cut off. Like it was like the Federalist versus the Democratic Republican. So even while they were so scared of this two-party system, they were still actively enforcing it. And I mean, I pretty much said everything Leah said, but I also said, I thought it was funny that Hamilton didn't really care where the Capitol was, and he just thought it was important that the bank buildings were secure because it's all about money.
Yeah, I also went off.
Of the fear factor that was discussed in episode 2 because it was at a militia, they were calling it in episode 2 in Pennsylvania, where they were rising up against something. I forgot what it was, but yeah, it's kind of just going on about how they created that district just out of fear that no state would be able to protect them in a way, and that Congress felt, which like kind of what Baxter said, how is in theory at the time it seemed like a good idea, but now obviously with where we are now and how big we are and all the little things you got to worry about, obviously now it seems like a terrible idea now.
To piggyback off of what everyone else was saying, I think I also referenced chapter 2. I was actually kind of going with what Sean just said, where I just put that one of the justifications was just the placement of where it was, where like they just put it in between like the state that like I thought about it as like a hindsight, it was like a north and south state. It was like pretty much directly what divided on the Mason-Dixon line, like the Confederacy and the Union. But of course, this was made before that. But like, I do feel like hindsight, that was like the line that kind of split it, which I just thought was more interesting rather than that was kind of funny. But I also do put that like I was agreeing with you off the fear factor and trying to just like figure what's going on with and like the banks and everything, like Talis said. And then for the non-state, I think I just wrote down the act that the Organic Act, which denied DC citizens like the right to vote within like a congressional election, and it pushed them because I remember them talking about originally when DC was founded, if you lived within the district, all you would have to do is commute outside to either Virginia or Maryland to vote. And then once this act passed, it like did not, they couldn't do that anymore because they were technically from those states, and then it was just like it was stupid, honestly.
Yeah, even if that's like their solution, like that still causes issues because it's just not where they live. Like I don't know. I just feel like the more and more I read about this and the more I like find out, it's just kind of like disconcerting that it's been going on this long. And I don't know, I agree with everything you guys have said. Makes a lot of sense.
I can read the next question if that's cool with everyone. I said, or it says, how has the decision to create DC as a non-state impacted the people living in the city, both historically and in more modern and/or current politics? Use specific examples of real-world events and/or policy to highlight the impact that this decision has on residents of DC. So I started with like talking about like episode 1, obviously taxation without representation, a huge problem from the beginning. And then like more specifically, I thought like the COVID Act was really important, like the Relief Act and how because they're not a state, they did not get as much funding as everyone else, even if they have more people in those areas. I feel like that's definitely like a very real world current problem and how like those people just had no control over like fighting a pandemic that no one knew how to handle. So like they were already just like in last place from the beginning, really. Another thing would be like the prison system from episode 5. That was really interesting to me how all prisoners are just sent to federal prison anywhere in the country. I think that's a huge thing. Like, I don't know, I just can't believe I didn't know that. And how it has like really upheld this like hierarchy in the prison system that's rooted in racism.
Yeah,
I'm gonna piggyback. Oh, you can go first. You go first.
I brought up like the same thing, the COVID funding. I thought that was really messed up that they kind of got screwed out of COVID funding and had no voice in Congress to speak up on that. Well, I guess they had a voice, but not a vote. And I mean, yeah, that's pretty much where I went with it was how are you gonna not let people speak up on their own and then deny them funding?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wrote about. For this part, I wrote about COVID, and then I also wrote about the like the incarceration system later on. I agree that was a super important part, and something that kind of like moves in silence because they don't have a voice for anybody. You know, they don't have a voice of their own. They have no representation in there, like in any situation, and like doing that to a group of people just because where they lived before just makes their lives like 10 times harder for no reason. But yeah, the COVID thing was definitely a big issue with me. Like, I just thought about how like difficult it was for everybody we knew during the pandemic to get relief, no matter where you lived, and like in some form, like somebody's family member or somebody that you knew was like directly impacted, maybe even you. So like just imagining like going through that like without any form of representation, anybody to talk to, anybody to turn to for answers, like a little clarity or just some reassurance, like that would be very difficult.
Yeah, to piggyback off that, I remember I've completely forgot about the prison system thing. That was insane to me, listening to that guy's story, how he got sent to like, I think you said he went to like Kentucky and then got transferred to West Virginia, and also said that the prison systems that he were sent to were like racist and like targeted people with the numbers. Remember he said that like if your inmate number ended in 007 or 016, you're like immediately picked on because you're not like from there. And I remember him saying that. I don't remember. I didn't write down what chapter that was. That kind of blew my mind because then it's also like once he gets out of jail, like how are you gonna get back? Your family can't visit you because you live hours away now. Like you most likely haven't talked to people in your family for a while. So like how are you like supposed to get home? That just it raised a bunch of questions and I feel like it was very like very swept under the rug. But because they don't have autonomy and statehood, they can't make like a state prison system within their or like within the district, which is just like I think that's an issue. So that thing that blew my mind. Um the COVID bill definitely in the first chapter was that was huge. Real like again, just rounding back to the point that there's so many people in the district, you can't like you should treat it as like a district's funding for like the COVID relief, you know, what I mean? Or like I worded that wrong, a state's funding because there's so many people there that like they are gonna need it. Um, What else did I put? I put the other thing I put was that again I went back on the DC delegate that goes to Congress and introduces and debates on bills but can't like vote on them. I just picked that little tiny part. I thought that was interesting. And then in historic terms, I put that DC has been a hub for civil rights because it's the nation's capital. So like I also feel like there's civil rights implications that are the reason that DC hasn't become statehood because like I remember someone was stating earlier that like one of the representatives was like saying something about how DC just wasn't responsible and was like making racist comments about that. So like that's what I'm at.
I said also the same thing, but I just want to add an example. In the first episode, they talk about the DC HIV and AIDS issue where they wanted to start the clean needle exchange and Congress shut it down because that's not what they believe in because Congress has control over DC. And I just thought that was unfair, especially because the residents supported the issue and they thought it would be really beneficial to their community and they weren't able to follow through because Congress blocked their funds.
I think that's a great point. I completely forgot about that story. Oh my gosh, that was also insane.
Also, second, I know I wrote it down in one of the later questions, but I want to say it was also like that group that is the reason that marijuana is legal because they pushed for it as like a relief in DC. I remember reading that too. I thought that was interesting.
Um, yeah, side note from that, DC not taxing weed or and any drug like anything like that is stupid. This is so stupid. Sorry, that was like something I found like just like ridiculous that like the city wasn't taking advantage of or setting an example for future cities who are like going to do the same thing, you know? It's becoming like a prevalent issue. I don't know. I thought that was like just an issue where like the city was like doing something that the people wanted them to or like would help them, but create like making it in such a way that they had to jump through loopholes that makes it like look shady, makes it like still seem like you're kind of like I guess like selling a drug.
And I think looking at DC, like especially like from episode 2 in the context, like it's a majority minority district. I think that that like just has huge implications for it not becoming a state yet. I think someone else had said that too, but I had written down like it's just really like discouraging, like especially like the Black communities there because it was such a like hub for slavery and as people moved north, they settled in DC and like the communities that were built there. I definitely think that that historical context is one of the reasons that it has not become a state yet.
Should we move on? Cool. I could do the third question. One of the things that can make debating DC statehood fraught with conflict is the assumption that each side makes about the motives of people who disagree with them. For example, the podcast discusses the Republican assertion that Democrats' support for DC statehood is merely a power grab, not a principled stand. And what do you make of that assertion? I thought the assertion was ridiculous. I mean, is it a power grab? Yeah, but it's like a power grab for a seat. It doesn't have to stay Democrat. Like is the first one probably going to be a Democrat? Yes, but that could change. I just thought the partisan polarization in the country has gotten so bad that politicians are willing to discard the livelihood of the like people in DC and kind of brush them aside as less than everybody else because they don't have a vote, they don't have representation, they don't have a lot of things that other US citizens have because of one extra Democratic vote. So I think, yeah, I just thought it was stupid. I also don't think that the Democrats make any sort of principled stand. I don't think any political party makes like a principled stand. I think it's all for their own good. Like I don't think the Democrats are fighting for DC statehood because of the people. I think they're fighting for the vote.
It's a good way to look at it.
Kind of going off
What Tala said, I definitely I feel like there's probably some truth behind it just because of how polarized we are now with everyone fighting for every little vote, because I did some research based off the question, and since 1964, when DC has gotten to vote in the electoral college, it has been blue every single year. So that's why I just felt like there's a chance there is some truth behind it, maybe for Democrats, but I also am not super sure on whether that's just something I thought about, where they were. That just made me think that there might be some truth behind it, just because ever since DC's had electoral votes, it's been blue in every single election up to this point.
The way I kind of see it is, what does it really matter if it is a power grab? You can't just say, oh, we're denying the rights to vote to the rights of representation for 700,000 Americans just because you don't like the way that they're going to vote. It just is not a sound argument at all.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Especially when you look at things like how like statehood was already kind of like ripped away from DC like a long time ago. Like we learned about that in a different episode. And like, yeah, I thought that like I did say that I thought it was reasonable to assume that DC would lean Democratic, you know. I think that's a very reasonable claim. But what I think is completely like irrational is there like that, yeah, I agree that that's the stupidest reason on earth for like DC to be not denied statehood, its representation. And I think that the Republican Party is probably looking at the grand scheme of things and thinking about the snowball effect that creating DC statehood could have, like when it comes to things like territories, like we learned about with like Puerto Rico and stuff like that. Like that could have just such a major impact on like the future of our voting scenarios. And like maybe even could have a like a good impact on our country once we consider all the citizens that we actually have. But yeah, that was just my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you guys are saying. Like, I'm pretty sure it was like Senator Tom Cotton is what I have written down as the one that was like really like pushing this point. And to me, it's like Congress should reflect the views of the people. So even if it's a party that you don't agree with, it's still the views of the people. So if Congress, like that's its whole point is to reflect that. I feel like it's just not an argument to say like, oh, because they know it's going to be Democratic, that's why Democrats want it. It's like, even if that is true, that still should be represented.
Yeah, I agree with everything I was saying. Like I did. I feel like it was a way to deny. It's just denying citizens the right to vote because they want to stay in power. Because like you all were saying, DC has historically been a blue city, so like they don't want to lose seats, or yeah, they don't want to like lose majority in Congress. But like fundamentally, it boils down to people cannot vote, which is like covered within the Constitution. So like, why are we not having that happen? You know?
Yeah, I think also like DC seems to be like leaning blue, and like that shouldn't be a problem, like again because Democrats have usually been the supporters of their issues. Like they've usually been like who's backed the idea of like DC, yeah, you should be a state. It's more or less just like when pressed with that issue, like it seems that Democrats have always taken like an actual stand on it, like seem to find some vested interest in the issue. And by comparison, like the Republicans just see the negatives that could come with it, and not at all of them. I actually found a couple like Republican representatives, like some who had like lived in DC and understood like the issues that came along with it and stuff like that. But yeah, like party wise, still made no sense.
Just weird question, weird thought. I want to see what y'all think about it. Do you think that DC would turn red if it was Republican support, or do you think it would stay blue based off of so if like Republicans were the ones supporting
I think
DC statehood?
it'd probably be a closer race.
Yeah, I still think it'd stay blue though, because
Yeah, I
that's
think
just
like
typically how urban environments go.
yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. You look at every city and you just find people like it's usually younger people, usually people who are
Yeah.
more involved in politics, because cities are kind of like their own like little political like living breathing thing.
I think if the
Political organisms.
Republicans, I think if the Republicans came forward and they said, we support DC statehood, it would become a bipartisan issue. because the
Yeah.
residents are blue, and then if it's like the typical Republican representatives that you see up there, like it's gonna be Ted Cruz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, all those people are gonna tell their followers, I support this, and then they're gonna support that too. But the people living there are gonna be blue. So I think it would make the whole thing a bipartisan issue.
We're ready to move on to the next part. A similar example in the podcast is Democrats' own assertion that Republican opposition to DC statehood is a racist attempt to maintain their political advantage. What do you make of that assertion? I think there's definitely a lot of racial implications in the roots of disenfranchising the district. But as it stands right now, I think it's like the whole Occam's razor, simplest explanation is the easiest one, and that they just don't want to give up traction and they don't want to have people who are going to vote against them in Congress. So I think it's harder to say what the motivation is now, but I think the main driving factor is just that they don't want more opposition.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's basically what I said. I didn't think it was like necessarily as much of a racial issue as today. I think that there is pockets of that, considering like that it is majority minority area, things like that. Um yeah, I just thought it lied like more within like political reasons today. You know, there's too many other issues that are like actually prevalent that actually I don't know. It hasn't been in anybody's benefit to be racist in a very long time. And I think that like this is just no different of an issue. It's still there and it's still gonna happen. And yeah, it's an issue, but like you can point your finger at so many other things that will be able to be justified so much quicker if you're like opposing the Republicans in this situation.
I would not disagree with what you guys have said, but I just think that if it is easy to say that there's a lot of other things that play into it, like obviously political party has a huge, huge factor. I just think that if you think of it in the context of if the communities in DC were made up of mainly wealthier, white, educated men, I think this wouldn't be a problem. So I think it is hard to say that like this isn't a racial issue, because if this was affecting more important, like historically important people in our country, I don't think this would have been a problem in the first place.
It's very fair.
I mean, technically, like it wasn't, because at first, when they made like when there was still like the slave trade going on in DC, they were saying that you could still vote from Virginia and Maryland. As soon as slaves became free, they take those rights away because of the Black communities there. So to me,
Mhm.
like it would be a huge racial implication, like a huge racial issue.
Yeah,
Does
you're
it-
definitely right in
it's like
saying that the issue started and is rooted in it.
Mhm. Yeah.
No,
I
I completely
said,
under.
sorry, I just wanted to add really, really quickly. So after uh the congressman Boss Shepherd or something, he like ran for representation and then way overspent his money. In episode 2, he like way overspent his budget. And then he blamed Black people. And then Congress blamed Black people for not being smart enough to elect a competent representative. So I think the issue is and has always been rooted in race, kind of like what Leah said.
No, and to add off that, because that was gonna be my next point is like I do feel like a lot of what I heard from like some of the congressmen on race was always that the citizens were never competent enough to elect someone, which is very degrading from what I've heard. Like for in the podcast, it's kind of degrading. So like I do think that it's like forefront based off of they're trying to stay in power and they don't want to have someone an opposition run against them. But I think like subconsciously in the back there is very much a part of it that's like based in racism and like racist belief. Especially like what Leah just said. Like if this wasn't if this was all white people or like white older men, like the majority that like represent in Congress, which because like most of Congress is white older men, this would not be an issue. I do not feel like it would. So
Yeah, I
Yeah,
just
I
feel
feel
like
like DC is a prime example of like just the overall issues we have, like a lot of these things are gonna get solved or well, if they're gonna get solved in DC, like I'm just as hopeful that they'll get solved in other places. And I completely agree that like younger people being empowered is like a huge thing. Our legislative issues are they're handled by people who are way too old.
yeah, I just feel like when it comes to racism,
Racism is just like we want to get rid of it. Obviously, we know it's bad, but I just feel like
we're trying to
get rid of racism in something that was founded on racism. It's very hard to get people to like get rid of racism, even if like they claim they're not racist, and there's kind of it's just kind of like a subconscious thing, almost like I discussed it for I just like had something last semester for a criminal justice class where it's like cops may say they're not racist, but it's like a subconscious thing where they're gonna like subconsciously assume maybe someone of a different race did this, or maybe it's just because for DC it's like
they say they're not
racist and they want DC to uh become a state and stuff like that, but it's just like something subconsciously that like can't get rid of.
with being because it's built on racism.
also, I think one more tidbit I want to add. When DC was founded in like the area that it was, I remember reading or listening to a part that said that there were like multiple like slave distribution companies within that area that would sell and like give slaves to other like states for like years, and it was almost like it took them so long to flush out that like, and then it was also like I think Baxter was saying it like it almost feels like once they disappeared is when DC kind of started to lose rights and representation.
I can read the next part. It says, talk to some friends and family about this debate. Based on what you hear is the assumption that the issue breaks down neatly across partisan lines, an oversimplification, or doesn't seem to accurately reflect attitudes on the topic of DC statehood. Were there any additional points made when talking to other people about the topic that the podcast didn't touch on? So I really just like talk to my family. And I have 4 sisters who are all very liberal. And so I kind of really only got like one perspective, which kind of sucks, but like a lot of them, like they showed support for statehood, obviously, like and like with the main assertion of taxation without representation. I feel like that's the easiest for everyone to get behind. Um, and then like I talked to like some people who like claim that they're like independents and things like that. Um, I did have like someone express that like they honestly just like didn't care. It doesn't affect them, so like they didn't spend any time thinking about it, but that's about it.
Yeah, I talked to a couple different people. I have some friends who I grew up with and both like sides of their grandparents, like both their parents like raised their families in DC separately. And were very like active in the like political community. Both their like both these guys' parents are like one of them runs for she's running for representative in Hanover County. Like they're very like implemented in these issues and they understand them and they had a lot to say, like they had a lot to say about like what these issues represented and stuff like that, and they just were talking about how like uh their grandparents have basically lived in like limbo like their entire lives, that their adult lives that they lived in DC, and although it's been easier for them because they had a little easier, they still had to fight for their neighbors, like they had to fight for the people around them, they had to fight for their own taxes, and they never really had any control. Although they did say that there were some forms of stability, because like DC is like a designated like I think they were talking about like gerrymandering or something like that. Like there's like that doesn't exist, but like what's the point in not being able to fight against gerrymandering if you don't have like a vote? It's kind of like what we all ended on. And then I also talked to a couple people who like were definitely on a different side of like the political spectrum than I am, and like don't really care about like political aspects. I kind of like tried to find people I knew like that. And they didn't really seem to know about the issue very much. But once like it was kind of like brought up to them, like, yeah, like why wouldn't they be able to vote? Why don't they get a representative? You know, even people who don't seem to care like have a very hard time finding reasoning like against it, you know, and they're just like showing the facts.
Something that was interesting to me, this is something I've talked to my parents about in the past. People who I know who are liberal tend to support DC statehood, but both my parents are conservative and they were born in DC. They're both from DC and they don't support it. And I'm like, wow, you've really gotten like sucked into the Republican rhetoric on that. It's kind of crazy how you can be from the district and not believe that they should have representation. It just doesn't make sense to me.
I talked to one conservative Republican about this, and when trying to like talk to her about this, she was like, "Wait, what do you mean DC gets a vote? Like they have multiple representatives in Congress." And I said, "No, they don't." And she said, "Yes, they do." And then pulled up the representatives from Washington State. And that about wrapped up my discussion. I was like, "Ooh, I'm done."
It's crazy, bro. That's wild. Um, I talked to I talked to some childhood friends, and they're mostly all conservative. And on that side, I feel like I either got that they just didn't really care about it, or that they didn't know about it and were like kind of like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. So like, I kind of got more of like a they either just didn't give at all, or they were kind of just like, that's interesting. And then obviously I feel like the people like here that I've talked to about it, like my friends in Richmond, are very much more like they don't know about it, but once I tell them like they don't have representation, like prison systems, like COVID relief, they got screwed over. They're all very much like, yeah, no, like that's not right. We need like I just feel like it was just like it was either they cared or they didn't. That was like the line. It was like the Republican friends I talked to just didn't care, and then the Democratic ones did. It was really weird.
Ready to move
Should
on?
we, yeah.
Yeah, question four, right?
Yeah.
I can read. Overall, what arguments in the podcast did you find most compelling in favor of DC statehood, or least compelling? Um, this is where I talked about like the judicial side and like the court system, and then how that leads into like the recorrection, well, I guess correction facilities or like things like that. That story that was told from the incarcerated guy who like he committed a very terrible thing like at a very young age, you know, but I find it very hard to justify like taking away his ability to talk to people who loved him or were close to him or knew him. And I think that um like just reading through that whole episode and like finding out how many like issues and how like it just kind of I don't know. It was like kind of like a hard swallow, you know. It was hard to like it was hard to read and it was hard to completely grasp like the ramifications. I mean, going from like DC to Tennessee or Kentucky like for that not being able to see anybody or making it so difficult for that just I don't know. That would not set up anybody well for their future life or like what they could do if they were given any sort of chance.
I think that the one for me was really the lack of like autonomy and control. Like in episode 5, where they were talking about the difficulties they had trying to pass marijuana legalization, and like what was brought up earlier with the needle exchange being blocked by Congress. And it's like, how are people not able to even make their own decisions about the place where they live? You have people who are elected representatives of Congress from across the country making decisions for the residents of Washington, D.C. and they don't even get a voice in it. They don't even have any voting rights to say, oh no, stand up on it. But yeah, I mean that, and just the whole, it's really just the whole lack of representation and autonomy. I feel like the main argument is the most compelling one.
Again, I
Yeah,
said something. Oh, sorry.
you can
Go
go.
ahead. Okay. I said something very, very similar. I was really said I don't really believe that there is an argument for DC statehood. It's really just like an injustice that needs to be fixed. And I said obviously the pros would be returning constitutional rights to residents of the United States, not allowing further taxation without representation, and then having full autonomy over their democratic and civil rights. And then in terms of the prison system, I kind of thought that that violates another one of their constitutional rights, because being sent that far away for not that like harsh of a crime, like I kind of looked into the prison system. I understand that there's higher tier security level systems that if you do like the worst crime that you do, you go there and it's like really in the middle of nowhere. And then there's like lesser, more like cushy jails. I don't know. But I thought it's like cruel and unusual punishment for them to be from Maryland or Virginia and then all of a sudden have to be uprooted to the middle of nowhere. Just like at a moment's notice, nobody can visit you. You don't know anybody there. It's not happening to anybody else in the country, just you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree with that. I talked about like how rehabilitation is like a huge, like, especially as like the prison systems are like being more exposed nowadays, like, and all the issues within them. Like, I think his name was Jamion Gray, it said from that episode. Like his story, it's like he did like obviously a very terrible crime at a young age, and I found myself like sympathizing with him, which I think that just shows like how devastating the issue is really, because like especially thinking about how it's a majority minority community, minorities are already more likely to be wrongly persecuted, and thinking about how we just got over like possession of marijuana being a federal crime. Like imagine being caught with weed and you get sent to the middle of nowhere and you can't talk to your family. Like we did hear from like a very extreme crime, but like thinking about it like going down, how like it's like it definitely is just very eye-opening.
yeah, I agree. I think just having some form of overall fairness, like if you just need to be given the same opportunities that every other citizen in the United States is, especially when it comes down to that. Like it's just too large of a group that's being like pushed to the side to be ignored anymore.
You ready to move on? What arguments in the podcast did you find least compelling in favor of DC statehood? The only one that really got me was just the difficulty of it, and it's not like an argument for why it shouldn't be done, but just why it would be difficult to get done. With how polarized the issue is, and the fact that it would really need a constitutional amendment to be passed, that you'd need 3/4 of the states to pass it. I just think it would be extremely difficult to get that through in the current environment, and there needs to be a lot more bipartisan support for it. Like I said, it's not necessarily an argument against it. It's just something that's going to make it more difficult.
To kind of piggyback off that a little bit, I thought that the least compelling argument that I found was the Republicans calling it a power grab, like we talked about earlier. I found that to be kind of least compelling because, like, I mean, as we've kind of talked about over this entire like podcast club thing, it's very much not like a sound argument when you think of the fact that like I was saying earlier, fundamentally, people do not have representation. So, power grab or not, you still have people that are not represented in this country, and not even just a little bit, a solid majority of them. So, I think that personally, that argument to me was the least compelling.
Yeah, I think that looking at like if I had to pick an argument for like DC not becoming a state. I think like the most compelling argument made was about like national security concerns, if I had to pick one, obviously. But then like even like I kind of like explained in like a little paragraph, like using like episode 2 to like talk about like how I understand like the fear aspect. However, like I already like rebutted that with like thinking about like the January 6th like insurrection and how that was like the National Guard was like not able to be called in a timely manner because they don't have a governor and President Trump was not going to call on it. So I think that although like a reason could be national security, we've seen an example where it would be more secure if it was treated as a state.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. I also like consider that. I think that the only it's just so hard to like ratify the Constitution. That was the only like justification I found for it. But I did think about the national security issues. I have a minor in like Homeland Security, so we talk about stuff like that like all the time, like how to keep information, like what's classified and stuff like that. And there's like a lot of variables that go into that, but the US is like very, very good about like we're very good about like keeping our information secret. Like it's very hard to do anything like that unless you're kind of like in a form of political power, then you kind of have to know and you've been voted in by the people and you're supposed to be trusted. It's just different ramifications, but I think at the end of the day, like national security with the form of something like a governor would be helpful. But I also think it's important to note that it is I find it very difficult to believe that we will ever see a situation like January 6th if we have a president who isn't as radical, to put it lightly, who might not be stupid enough not to call the National Guard. I don't know. That was just my thought behind that, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
I said my least compelling argument was that Congress thinks they should have complete control over the area where their offices are. And I kind of referenced episode 1 and episode 2. Sorry, my AirPod is staticking. But I mean, it makes complete consent. It makes sense for the government to have complete control over the government buildings. But again, DC has a lot of residential neighborhoods, school systems, businesses, like families live there and stuff, and the government doesn't need to control that.
I think there's definitely ways to work around it. Like, I don't know. Does anybody have any like more thoughts, or are we gonna move to the final part?
I'm good to move on.
Word. Okay. Using information from last week tonight episode on U.S. territories, in what ways, if any, do your opinions about granting or not granting statehood to D.C. extend to the debate over Puerto Rican statehood? Be specific and explain why or where you see similarities and differences between the two debates and how those thoughts and feelings shape your overall support or opposition to statehood for Puerto Rico and potentially other territories. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. I think that there's like could be a snowball effect. Like this is what the Republican Party was worried about. Like if more territories who would probably have more like left-leaning voters were to be like it could obviously go very poorly for them. But I think that's just like an example of how they need to change their thoughts to represent the people that they represent. You know, they need to take a pivot, and if that's the case, like those are the people they represent. That is a part of who it is, and that's something that we decided we wanted as our territory. We have to use it, like exactly what we did with Hawaii. We made it into a state after a territory before DC became a state. And I don't know. I didn't really ever think about how like difficult it was for Puerto Rico to have any like representation and stuff like that. And I ended up talking to one of my friends who's like his mother is Puerto Rican. She lived there like basically more like most of his life, and he just like talked about like how he didn't really understand these issues, how he didn't think about them, but his mom most definitely noticed them, and I think it kind of creates a separation between like the people of like those territories and the nation, and I don't think that's good.
What I said on it is basically I just think most of the arguments that they're trying to make for DC don't apply to Puerto Rico. And I mean, it's not, there's no fear of influence on the capital. There's nothing like that. So there really isn't a solid argument against it. The only thing I can say is one of my friends is Puerto Rican, and he said he's fed up with American people coming over there and like taking Puerto Rican jobs. And he is kind of against it because he feels like it's more Americanization of Puerto Rico.
That's actually like really interesting, and I wouldn't have
Yeah.
thought about that at all.
If
I
they
think,
want to keep it the same, they got it.
yeah,
If they
that's
don't
what I'm
want to be
saying. It's like,
colonized, yeah. If they don't want to be colonized, like do not colonize them. Leave them
yeah,
alone.
because at first I'm like, oh, they can't vote for president. They don't have voting power. Yeah, like they should. But now that like from that perspective, it's like hands
Yeah.
off.
Gives them their own like form of government if they want that. But I guess yeah, they should have the option to choose. Like that's I guess like the overall grand scheme.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think it really should just be up to the Puerto Rican people and how they want to move forward with that. But I don't think that there should be opposition from American government about that if it's what they want.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I said the same thing I just kind of talked about. One of the videos, Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, I think is how you say it, talks about the lack of representation and advocacy on behalf of like territories like hers, and she wanted to have that kind of, she wanted Puerto Rico to have that kind of access. But again, that just goes to show that you don't really know whether or not the politician that's representing your territory is supporting your best interest or theirs.
I definitely agree with that. I was putting pretty much the same thing as everyone else said. I think use the example of the America's Samoan territory. Learning about that. I remember learning there that they're like the best military recruiter in the like United States who isn't even in the United States because it's a territory. Um, but after kind of what Sean said, I guess yeah, I kind of agree with everyone saying it's up to them. If they want, it should go territory by territory. If a territory wants to join and like it would think we should give them that option, but if they don't want to, they want to be left alone, then like we should just hands off. It's not pull like a Britain and touch something and destroy it. Like if they want to live their own life, let's just let them live their own life.
That stuff about American Samoa in that like segment of the John Oliver thing kind of shocked me too. Just wanted to say that. The fact that like 20, I think it was 27% are veterans, I'm like, wow. And they're not getting representation and they're fighting for the US. I thought that was pretty messed up, honestly.
That was the big thing I wrote about in that last thing that we did was like that we have some of these like territories that fight for us. Like some of these people like definitely do want to be a part of the union. But again, it comes down to who and like what. Because again, to your point, like your friend from Puerto Rico thinks it's a bad idea. And I'm sure that most people in Puerto Rico probably think it's a bad idea. But like it just depends on the person and the territory.
Yeah. Does anybody have any like final closing thoughts before we end? Cool. Well, super fun last podcast, guys. Great semester. I'll see
Arm,
you
yeah.
Thursday.
See you guys.